And if you could turn today to 1 Samuel chapter 1. It's been said behind every good man is a better great woman. Well, you could almost say that behind every great prophet is a great mother. And in looking at Hannah this morning, the mother of Samuel, who was the last of the judges. He was the first of a new line of prophets after Moses. In Jeremiah 15:1, God says, even if Moses and Samuel stood before me, he would not spare the judgment of God upon his people. It was Samuel who established a school of prophets. He anointed two kings, Saul and David. He gave spiritual leadership to a people who were in transition. It was the generation of the judges when everyone did that which was right in their own eyes, but for some exceptions. We'll see that in Hannah there was a very powerful exception. Don't be afraid to go against the tide. Don't be afraid to swim against the current. With God's help, be an exceptional believer in Jesus. And today I want to look at Hannah in a few different ways, the way that she is presented in Scripture. In verse 1 of 1 Samuel 1, we're told about Hannah's husband, Elkanah, and I will avoid reading all those difficult words in verse 1. She had a husband, Elkanah, who was from a place known as Ramah. Ramah, at this point in Israel's history, he came from a town that was just another place in Israel. Had no great significance. It would later be known as the place where Samuel was born. Her son would make that town famous. But at this point in the story, it's just another town, a town you could easily look past and look beyond and not think about twice. We know from the chronologies that this was a Levite family. There was priestly blood in the line, and Samuel would be a priest, but also a prophet. So we have Hannah's husband, Elkanah, and his pedigree and where he is from. And then what we see in verse 2 brings us back to earth. Crashing down. Hannah was from a very dysfunctional family, you could say. Very dysfunctional family. Look at verse 2. He had two wives. The name of one was Hannah, indicating she was the first one he married. The name of the other, Peninnah. And then we're told something at the second part of verse 2 that kind of explains everything. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. It's probably why he married his second one. Probably why he married another one. Because as much as he loved his wife, we know from chapter 1 unfolds that she could not bear him children. And so in those days, despite the plan of God for marriage in Genesis, there was this need, we just have to have children. We want to make sure that our tribe doesn't go out of existence. We want to make sure there's another generation to take my name and to keep the land. And just pragmatism set in. Even though Elkanah, as we'll see from chapter 1, is what we'd call a godly man. He has taken a second wife. And verse 3 says that this man went up from his city yearly to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh, where the tabernacle had become a somewhat permanent structure somewhat permanent structure. It's like when you attach a caravan to a tent almost, you know. It's not quite a house, but it's a bit more permanent than a tent. And verse 3 contrasts two families, Elkanah's family and Eli. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priests of the Lord, were there. These turn out to be very corrupt young men. And it says, whenever the time came for Elkanah to make an offering, he would give portions to Peninnah, his wife, to all her sons and daughters. I mean, think of the contrast to all her sons and daughters. She's at least got 4, 5, 6 children. Many, many children. To Hannah's none. But, verse 5, to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah, although the Lord had closed her womb. This was God's doing. God had done this. And it says it. We don't even get to guess it or infer it. God had closed her womb. Does God open some wombs and close others? Yes, he does. He opens and he closes. He gives life, he ends life. God is in control of all of these things. So it is a divided home. And look at verse 6, because this is painful to read. And her rival, this is Peninnah, her adversary, her enemy. The Bible calls Peninnah her enemy. Also provoked her severely to make her miserable because the Lord had closed her womb. There were some promises back in Deuteronomy that if God's people obeyed him, there would be great fertility. And if they disobeyed him, there would be barrenness of the womb. And so it wasn't uncommon to think that if God's blessed you with a bunch of kids, then you must be really keeping the covenant. And if you didn't have any kids, then you know, what on earth are you up to? What have you been doing behind closed doors? What kind of commandments have you been breaking? And Peninnah plays on that. She trades on that. Does she remind Hannah of those verses of blessing and cursing? I mean, this is a real nasty woman. Real nasty. And by the way, nastiness is not a masculine or feminine problem, it's a human problem. We all do it sometimes. And Peninnah got really nasty. And yet both are in an unsatisfactory situation, don't you think? No one wanted to share Elkanah. They didn't get much choice in this. They both are part of this divided home that doesn't change. Wonder, what would you pick if you're a single woman? Is it half a husband or no husband? Some would want the company. Some would take the company. Some would say, no, I'm not going to share anything. It's just me and him or nobody, right? But they don't even get that choice. This is a very difficult family situation. And yet Hannah is still not alone, because we know that among the patriarchs there was a problem of barrenness, infertility. Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, the mother of Samson, struggled. Elizabeth, mother of John the Baptist, struggled with that. So both of these women are carrying some burdens. Neither wanted the other in the home. It reminded them that their life under the sun was not as it should be. It shouldn't have been this way. There should have been him and one of them. That's how it should have been. But it wasn't. Why? Because there's a curse on the world and people make sinful or unwise choices. They each had gaps in their life. They each wanted their husband's exclusive attention, but neither really could. And it says in verse number 8 that Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? And you know, he is he unaware of all this? Maybe. Why do you not eat? And why is your heart grieved? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? He's a father. He thinks he's so good to her, and he was. But evidently not. So we have a very dysfunctional, broken family that God is greatly going to use. I'll tell you that. God is greatly going to use this family somehow. Despite this dysfunction, Hannah shows that she has a wonderfully devoted heart. Wonderfully devoted heart. And look at verse 9. Hannah arose after they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat of the doorpost of the tabernacle of the Lord. And she, it says in verse 10, was in bitterness of soul, and she prayed to the Lord, and she wept in anguish. I mean, she could have easily expressed that bitterness toward Peninnah. She could have expressed that to her husband. But she takes all of that, and it is messy when we get bitter and angry. It's very messy. She takes all of that and she takes them to someone who can listen and hear and do something about it. Takes it to God. But she goes beyond bringing her complaints to God. She is moved somehow within her heart to make God a promise. To make God a promise. And she said, O Lord of hosts, God of all of the heavenly hosts and the angels, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and do not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child. 3 times she says, I'm your servant. She's not ordering God around. She's not visualizing the gift God's going to send. She's not naming and claiming. She's not putting God in a corner and saying, all right, within 9 months, I want to see something. He's the Lord, she's the servant. That's how prayer works. He's the Lord, she's the servant. He says, but will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life. I mean, she's thinking from day one. Day one. And no razor shall come upon his head. What was known as the Nazirite vow. It's an outward display of total dedication. So Hannah doesn't seek revenge on Peninnah. She doesn't try and manipulate her husband like Leah and Rachel did to Jacob. You know, maybe if you get number 3 and she can have children, but then they can sort of be mine. They can be my children. We'll just pretend that they're mine and yours, which is what the patriarchs would do. But she goes to the Lord with this burden, and the reasoning is, well, if God has closed this avenue for me, maybe he might open it for me too. Entirely legitimate and good. And yet this request, and don't miss this, this request goes beyond merely a woman wanting to satisfy her maternal urges. You've got to understand that. This is more than a woman saying, well, I've got a husband, And if I don't have a child, if I don't go through the birthing experience and hold a baby in my arms, I'm really not a woman, or I'm not complete, or my life is going to be jigsaw puzzle with just the biggest piece missing. It's not that. It's not that. She has this sense that she wants to have a child for the Lord. For the Lord. Not just for herself. No matter what that blessing is for parents to bring a child into the world, and particularly mothers. Yes, that is a God-given blessing. God-given blessing. But that's not everything. And that should never be an idol to pursue. Yes, she asked for a child. She asked for a son. She asked specifically. She wants a little boy, right? She's specific. She's got a purpose here. She's probably surveyed the land. And there aren't many godly men around. Aren't many saying, "Thus saith the Lord." So if God could give her a son, this could be a blessing, not just to her, but to many, even to the whole nation. So her prayer was more than just satisfying her maternal instincts and desires. Understand that. And Hannah just lifts us into the heavens. She lifts us with her godliness, and then Eli brings us straight back down again. Look at Eli. In verse 12, he watches her mouth, right? And in verse 13, now Hannah spoke in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. So she was uttering, the voice, her lips were moving, but words weren't coming out, nothing, no sound coming out. And Eli thinks of the people that he sees who do that most of the time, drunks. And so he accuses her of drunkenness. He doesn't check, he accuses in verse 14. But Hannah answered and said in verse 15, "No, my Lord, I'm a woman of sorrowful spirit. I've drunk neither wine nor intoxicating drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. Don't consider," verse 16, "your maidservant a wicked woman. For out of the abundance of my complaint and grief I have spoken until now." How hardened Eli had become. I mean, if the spiritual leader of Israel can't distinguish her from a drunkard, you know how this nation is heading. You know where it is going. John Bunyan said in prayer, it's better to have a heart without words than words without a heart. That's what God's concerned about. Now Eli, who ends up really disqualifying himself, he has wicked, corrupt sons that he will not restrain. The fact is, he's still high priest, still is. And he has a blessing for Hannah that God honours. God honours Eli's blessing. Look at 17. "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition, which you have asked of him." And she said, "Let your maidservant find favour in your sight." So the woman went away and ate, and her face was no longer sad. When did the joy return? It wasn't when Samuel was born. It was before. She left with joy. The burden had lifted. God had heard her, that Eli had blessed her. 5 times in this chapter she calls herself a handmaid. She's a servant, and God had blessed her and given her peace even before he answers her prayer. Friends, the joy of the Lord is not dependent on God answering our prayer. It's God's presence in our lives. It's the Holy Spirit within. whether the sun comes or not. And I want you to see the divine intervention, because in verse 19 they get up early and they worship. They return home. In the end of verse 19, Elkanah knew Hannah, his wife. This is going to be very different from Mary's conception. Those other times when God opens the womb, it's he blesses the marital union, the physical union. But it says in verse 19, the Lord remembered her. And you know what this does? This takes us back to Exodus, when God remembers his people. This is God not just remembering one woman, but he is remembering an entire nation. He knows there is much more at stake than just one mother's request for a child. And in verse 20, it came to pass in the process of time, those 9 or so months, that Hannah conceived and bore a son, called his name Samuel, saying, because I've asked for him from the Lord. Samuel means God added. God added. It was the most natural name to give him. Now, God's answer to Hannah was exceptional, because many a wife has prayed for a child, didn't get one. We've got to acknowledge that. It was an exceptional answer. But we know from this chapter that Hannah went home with joy. She went home contented. Sometimes God answers, and sometimes he doesn't. But that's true of many things in our life. That's it's beyond children, it's everything. God says yes, and he says no. But God remembered her. But think about the husband here. Look at what it says in verse 21. Now the man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and his vow. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, not until the child is weaned. Then I'll take him, maybe the first 2 or 3 years, as best as we know, that he may appear before the Lord and remain there forever. Oh my, she's going to keep her promise. She's going to keep her promise. But she'll wait till he's weaned. Not till he's teaned. He's weaned. 23, so Elkanah, her husband, said to her, do what seems best to you until you've weaned him. Only let the Lord establish his word. Then the woman stayed and nursed her son until she had weaned him. Now Elkanah, he's going to miss out on a son with the wife that he really loves. They're going to miss out on some things here. He's supportive. He's seen God's work in his wife's life. She certainly told Elkanah about her vow. Under Jewish law, he could have done? He could have reversed it. Could have overruled. Could have said, Hannah, I know you love him, I know you love God, but he's staying here. My call. He doesn't set aside her vow. He supports her. We must admire Elkanah as well. And it says in verse 23, so Elkanah, her husband, said to her, do what seems best to you until you have weaned him, only let the Lord establish his word. And then look at verse 24, an offering is brought. Now when she had weaned him, she took him up with her and 3 bulls, 1 ephah of flour and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord in Shiloh. And the child was young, and they slaughtered a bull and brought the child to Eli. They left him with Eli? Yeah, because he's a high priest. And this was an act of faith, let me tell you, to leave their son with Eli. Hannah was teaching her son, very young, that we live to serve God. They bring the necessary sacrifices to the Lord. Look at verse number 5. "O my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood by you here praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition, which I asked of him. Therefore I also have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he shall be lent to the Lord." So they worship the Lord there. Hannah, she's a new mum. And yet she understands some very deep theological truths that our children, it makes us mums and dads, are temporary gifts. They're on loan. They're on loan. Like the library books you get. They're on loan. And they ultimately belong to God. Psalm 127:3, "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward." And so Hannah gives Samuel back. It's the only right thing for her to do. And Samuel grows up in that temple, so in that tabernacle. We know from chapter 2 that she makes him a little outfit. Is this little priest. You ever seen a little boy in a little sailor suit? So cute. He's in this little priest's outfit. And he grows up in that whole environment. Wouldn't you love if you had to go to the hospital and you needed a surgeon to look at you? Wouldn't it be awesome if you found this surgeon and his parents had just left him at the hospital at 3? And all the nurses are his sisters, and all the doctors help him and train him. This doctor is just a living, breathing medical machine, right? Samuel had this very long apprenticeship. He saw a lot of things, often not very good, but given back to the Lord. It's exceptional. That's exceptional, right? God's plan is for children to be at home with their parents, not to be left the tabernacle. But in this particular case, that was God's will. And what Hannah does in chapter 2, we won't read it again today. We read it already. Her praise to the Lord for what God did rivals the prayer of the Song of Moses. It rivals how Mary praised God after Christ was born. The focus of this prayer in 1 Samuel 2 is that God rescues the humble and he sets down the proud. He looks for those who will submit to him, who will follow him. He looks for those who will make sacrifices for him, even their children. And so mothers, love your children, care for them, pray for them, but don't make them idols. Don't make them idols. God may have a claim on them down the track. And you don't want to be opposed to that. You don't want to be in opposition to that. You want to support what God is doing. Because after all, they belong to him. He opens and closes the womb. They're a heritage, they're fruit. But don't make them anything beyond that.